So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Introduction to Meanwhile Use webinar. My name is Jen Storen, and I work for an organisation called Meanwhile Space. We've been creating Meanwhile projects for over 10 years now. And so on behalf of our sister charity, Meanwhile Foundation, we've put together a programme to support the development of Meanwhile Use in Brighton and Hove, of which this introductory event today is the first part. This programme grew out of the efforts of Brighton's creative and cultural industries to drive recovery after COVID, which had such a harsh impact on the sector. And it sits within Brighton's ABCD for Cultural Recovery programme. The idea for today's event is to talk about what Meanwhile Use is, what you can do with it, what the benefits are, and some of the challenges you might come up against. And we have a really great lineup of speakers to help us explore this. Emily Bowen is Director of Meanwhile Space and a trustee of the Meanwhile Foundation. And we'll kick off proceedings today with an overview of what Meanwhile Use is and what types of projects you can create with it. Then Jess Sang, who is a trustee of the Meanwhile Foundation, will discuss some of the benefits of Meanwhile Use, both for those involved in setting up and using Meanwhile Use projects and for the wider communities and places that they are part of. Shirley Welty from Brilliant Brighton Bid is going to talk to us about the recent Meanwhile programme she helped organise and why she did it and some of the obstacles she encountered along the way. And finally, we were really happy that Jane McMorrow and William Shaw are able to join us. Jane and William ran the recent Bookmakers project in Brighton and are going to share with us how they found that experience and what it took to make the project a success.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Okay, so as Jen said, I work for a company called Meanwhile Space, and I'm also a trustee of Meanwhile Foundation. This Meanwhile and Creative Use training is a joint collaboration between those two organisations. What I want to talk to you guys about today is about Meanwhile Use and its role and what it can do, but particularly thinking about where space is at a premium or it's difficult to get hold of. What kinds of Meanwhile Uses can we seek out and make happen in slightly unusual circumstances? So a little bit about Meanwhile Space. We've been going for 13 years now. We're a community interest company, and our role is really about how do we make places better by using spaces that are derelict or underused in some way. So we take on particularly difficult, redundant buildings and then work with local communities to bring them into use. And usually that's some kind of affordable workspace, creative use, cultural activities, all manner of different kinds of uses. So we currently have around about 80,000 square foot. Most of that is in outer London neighbourhoods, usually places that are undergoing quite significant change. We have also done city centre projects and projects outside of London as well. One of our big projects is in Hastings on a kind of longer term basis. Typically, we partner with local authorities, developers and housing associations to deliver our projects. And we've delivered about 70 projects now, from teeny tiny little shops to public toilets and arches and petrol stations and office blocks and absolutely anything that you can imagine that may be available. So it's that approach that I'd like to talk to you about. This is our most recent project in Ebury, which is kind of south of Victoria in London, and gives you a kind of flavour of the kind of use, the kind of projects that we're delivering today. A little bit of context about Brighton and why we want to run these projects, why we want to run this training session, and why we think it's really important. Brighton's reputation as a creative innovator is part of its identity and appeal, and there's so many people working within the creative and cultural industries within Brighton that have really struggled through COVID, as Jen talked about a little bit in the introduction. But the rising cost of living, in like it is in so many places, but particularly prevalent in Brighton, and working and finding space in the city is pushing out those creative industries. Plus, we've got very, very low levels of vacancy within the city. Business rates are really high. This makes it really difficult for people to find space to do kind of interesting, innovative, creative, cultural projects, and poses challenges for landlords and creatives and anyone who really cares about the city. So meanwhile use is a tool that creatives can use to take some ownership, to seek out and activate space. And how we unlock those spaces for creative uses will enable people to continue to flourish and grow. And that's really what we want to explore through this series of programs and events that we're running. So this was our very first space, and is the kind of sort of probably what you think of typically pop-up shop. We got hold of a space and really small shop and sort of got going with it, and we've sort of tried to experiment with everything that we do along the way. But where these spaces aren't available, that's really kind of where we're interested in kind of talking about. So the benefits, a little bit about the benefits. So benefits to landlords of meanwhile uses is they get lower costs during their vacant periods, that they increase the prospects of a future commercial use in that space. They get the security of active occupation, so much less antisocial behaviour or risk of squatting, usually lower insurance premiums, things like that. The cost, the benefits to people using space is typically that it will be a kind of low cost, low commitment space. So it's not no cost, but it is lower than a typical commercial rate, that it's usually quite a high profile space, and that it's really a chance for innovating, growing, taking risks, and experimentation. The benefits to local people and the general public are that there's less dereliction and blight, that it attracts visitors and potential investors to an area, that it creates a sense of vibrancy. Usually there's more accessible activities and events and services, and that it maintains vibrancy and diversity on the high street away from that kind of clone town, chain store type approach, much more kind of unexpected activities. So I wanted to talk to you briefly about the way that we approach projects, as an example being our Loughborough Junction work, where we've been since 2014. And we were asked to come there by the charity JP Morgan Chase Foundation and the local authority. They were having a huge amount of antisocial behaviour issues in the area, but they were wanting to run enterprise programs to support people to develop their own ideas and start to kind of grow those ideas into job opportunities for themselves and others. So when we arrived, this is what we were met with: needles on the ground, people living out of vans and dealing drugs out of them and using them as kind of crack dens, and fly tipping, prostitution, visible drug dealing. I mean, literally, you name it, it was happening. There wasn't a huge amount of space in this area. So there isn't a lot of commercial space, but what there was very underused. So there's lots and lots of vacant arches in the area. It's where 3 different train lines meet. Lots of access to those arches is restricted, but also they're all in very, very poor condition. And there was also this public toilet, or former public toilet, that was currently being used as a crack den, and as the local authority enforcement team kind of evicted the squatters who were in there, they were running out the back and we were kind of coming in the front. So it was a bit of a surreal day, and at the end of that day we took the keys and we had to get started there, but actually people were quite happy with what this space was being used for before. We had a little group of street drinkers out the front. They didn't really want anything to happen in there, but over a period of time we cleaned it up. We set up a program where we invited people to come and give us their ideas in return for some free space and some support to use the space. So people pitched their ideas and we started to get this kind of program of activity and events happening there. And as that progressed, relationships with Network Rail started to progress, and conversations with them around how we might expand out into the available arch spaces. So we took on these 2 arches and used them as a kind of a different kind of activity. So the platform space was more about front customer facing activities, and then these 2 units were more for desk-based activities or for holding workshops or that kind of activity, which didn't have to be have very high footfall. So we were kind of really listening to the community, understanding what people needed, trying to find what spaces there were, and kind of rolling with that in quite an organic way. And then following on from that, Network Rail offered us more space. They saw the benefit of of people using the spaces, of the community that was starting to form, of the kind of new energy that was coming forward. So as people were kind of growing through that program and ready to take spaces on their own, they started to take arches, like whole arches for themselves rather than sharing them, and starting to use them for all manner of different kinds of activities. So this was one of our kind of more weird and wonderful. This is a slime factory, which produced slime, did children's workshops, worked with people with learning difficulties, and kind of sensory activities, and was really very successful. And then the kind of next stage of what we're thinking was these really very poor condition arches. And so we proposed to the council that we should go for some funding to look at a design competition for how we might solve some of these problems for these really, really poor condition, hard to use arches, of which there's quite a few in the area. So we commissioned we got some funding from the Greater London Authority and commissioned up and coming architecture practice to think about sort of almost a kind of pop-up solution that would make it dry and warm and comfortable inside, that could kind of slot in and out again for very short-term uses. And this kind of plywood, almost sort of Meccano solution was what they came up with. That started to kind of expand the opportunity for the spaces that we could take on in the area. And then following on from that, so probably a few years after we've been doing this kind of work, the council had the opportunity to apply for quite significant sum of capital money to build permanent workspace. So there'd never really been the demand there before, but actually the networks that we were building and the engagement and the interests from people to use the spaces for all different kinds of activities, from kind of makers to more sort of traditional art exhibitions or music workshops, meant that they actually felt confident to be able to make this kind of longer term commitment. So there was some a piece of land that was also being used for a meanwhile use for growing space, that they thought, well, actually we can maximize that, we can put workspace on it, and we can still have the growing space kind of around these structures. So this is LJ Works, which meanwhile space will become the operators for, before building the capacity for a community-led operator to take over the running of this building. So the kind of narrative of how to use empty space to impact a particular area is kind of really strong for us here. There really wasn't a lot of space, and it's kind of working with what you've got, building strong partnerships and sort of being led a little bit by the nose of what's possible. But of course, there's lots of other places that are doing really exciting things, and with again, not necessarily much traditional shop space. This is the Creative Common in Bristol, which was a derelict piece of land just behind the Temple Mead station. And they got some Arts Council funding to work with the council to run this programme of creative and cultural events and activities for 9 months. And so they built these structures, they created sculptures, they created jobs for loads of local creative people to develop exhibitions and activities, and they did lots of circus performance and events to support that and go alongside that, and it was a very successful project. Another one which I like to talk about as well, because it used something that most people would have kind of passed over as not really usable space. So this is a project called Cinerolium, which was run by a collective of architects and other sort of social disciplines and creative disciplines called Assemble, who then subsequently went on to win the Turner Prize. They saw a derelict petrol station and proposed to use it as a cinema. And so they gathered all the kind of waste materials that they could to try and create this kind of enclosed space, this fabric drapes that drop down, and created all the seating. They ran it with all volunteers, and they ran it for, I think it was a very short period of time. It was only a month or so, but sort of shows you the kind of way to repurpose very difficult to use spaces in a way that that creates a sense of kind of vibrancy, but also expectation and kind of interest. Another project using a site, this was in East London, in Canning Town, was another architect called Ash Sakula. They ran a project called Caravanserai. So a very, very community-led creative and cultural program of activities. And they had this huge, it was actually a really massive site. And over a period of time, they with volunteers, developed these different spaces and parts of the site to use for different activities. They built this barn from waste materials, and ran a whole series of events and activities, a lot of skill sharing, and really kind of prioritizing community need, but in a kind of very creative and enthusiastic and vibrant way. So where there isn't even space like that, another opportunity are alleyways. In Hastings, one of the ways that we've brought kind of vibrancy and carved out space is in an alleyway. And there are these kind of like hidden pockets where people busk and do activities, but we've also kind of created these little kiosks down there. And on event days, these can be really, really exciting, kind of interesting places to sort of wander through. And it's the unexpectedness of turning a corner and expecting a kind of dingy alley, but actually getting something really vibrant and exciting. Perhaps where you aren't able to or don't want to take on the responsibility of a whole shop, in Margate a number of years ago, a whole load of artists took on kind of opportunities for displaying their artwork within empty shops that were waiting for future tenants. It's a good way to raise profile without necessarily incurring costs, and another consideration to think about. We've also taken on office blocks, which you wouldn't think of as being particularly creative spaces, but Electric House in Willesden Green we took on and used the whole building as a kind of combination of studios, but also site-specific artwork, exhibitions, events, activities and workshops as well. And then this is our latest building. So this is on a really, really challenging site. It runs over a tunnel. It runs alongside a vehicle tunnel, but also a train tunnel. So you can't build any foundations. Like, it's a really, really challenging project. And so we've developed this kind of lightweight demountable structure that we can then move on to other places. But it's just to give you a kind of flavor of actually how it's possible to push the boundaries, the different scales at which we could initiate different meanwhile activities. And where there's where space is a limited resource, one of the things that I think is really important is to consider less desirable locations. So a lot of people think, oh, well, I'll take a pop-up space in the city centre and that's all I want, and I only want that. Jane and William will talk to you about that experience as well a bit later on. But it's you know, it's also important to consider if you took space in a kind of secondary high street or places slightly out of the city centre where you might actually be able to stay a bit longer. There's maybe less pressure on the turnover for that space. There's certainly less business rates, and how you might be able to make that more of a destination, build more of a community. And so there's certainly benefits to different kinds of locations. And as I hope that I've maybe shown you, that it doesn't just have to be a shop space to be able to be usable and create something interesting. So you've got sites and petrol stations and arches and undercross and alleyways and rooftops, even upper floors of shops. Underused space and vacant space is absolutely everywhere once you really start looking for it. Collaborate with others to share resources, energy and skills. These kind of projects take quite a lot of money. They take a huge amount of energy. They take a lot of different skill sets. So sharing the burden of that with others is really kind of important to do and to think about doing. And start small and learn as you go. I think try not to bite off more than you can chew. I've seen lots of people try to do that and sort of fall down along the way. But actually, if you start with a small space and test it for a short period of time and then try somewhere else and grow, actually you'll find it easier to convince partners and landlords to let you have space if you've been able to prove what you've done before, but also you'll be able to know how you can deliver it, what support you might need, and what you might be able to get from it. But we're certainly here to provide any advice and guidance that you may be looking for, and wish you the best of luck.
That was great. Really kind of interesting insight into the variety of creative things that you can do with temporary space. Now I think Jess is going to talk to us a bit about some of the benefits of meanwhile use.
Okay, well, thanks to Jen and Emily for inviting me to speak. As I think they've mentioned, I'm a fellow trustee with Emily on the Meanwhile Foundation, but I'm also, I work at the Greater London Authority and I lead on the community-led housing programme. So I'm here to talk to you today a bit about what the benefits of meanwhile use is for users and town centres. Let me make sure I can change my slide. Yeah. Okay, so I worked for Meanwhile Space for almost 10 years alongside Emily, so have seen most of the projects she's talked about to you today come into being, and that's everything from the scale of the single shop to what you see in the photo on the left, which is a whole street of meanwhile use, including sort of, yeah, the first housing project Meanwhile Space ever did, but also a 6-story building full of social and entrepreneurs. And I sit on the board of Meanwhile Foundation, and we exist to spread the benefits of meanwhile use more nationally. And in terms of what I do for the Greater London Authority, as I mentioned, I lead on a programme of £38 million revenue and capital investment programme to support people who want to do their own housing. And the example I've put on the screen is one that I really like. It's Tonic Housing have launched the UK's first LGBT plus retirement community. And so all of that together, just to sort of set the scene of my perspective on meanwhile use is basically just a belief in participatory placemaking and the sort of role that individuals have to affect change and make things happen for themselves in their places. In terms of the scale of meanwhile use benefits, so I think for me, just trying to split out the benefits to the users from the benefits to the place is quite tricky, because essentially the benefits are nested in one another. So if you have an empty space and a person takes it on, obviously they're trialing and testing something, the benefit goes to that individual, but it goes to the collective of people that are occupying the space, and then up to the space itself. It's no longer sort of at risk of further degradation, it's safer, it's cleaner. And then that scales up to the place. So the more meanwhile use that is done, and especially the more it's sort of designed really based on need in a place, the more impact it can have on a place scale. So just to talk you through some examples of these different scales of benefits, the first one I've got for you is Altrincham in Manchester. And it's actually it's not in the centre of Manchester, it's a suburb on the outskirts. And the graphic you see on the right was in 2010, Altrincham, it was in the press because it had the worst vacancy rate in the UK. So it had over 30% of spaces vacant, obviously very tragic story, and something that really galvanized the community around the issue. And they thought, we can't have this, we can't have Altrincham in the press for these reasons. And so that launched a whole package of different measures to try to address that. Meanwhile use was a core part of that, but only one part of the full package. So they also built a community steering group who kind of made sure they knew the businesses out there, connected with them, connected them into empty spaces, did micro grants, launched a whole sort of series of public realm works to improve the streetscape, reduce car traffic, increase pedestrianisation. And the meanwhile use programme kind of went across a few different scales. The poster on the left is their pop-up shop programme, which was in the sort of central retail quarter alongside quite high-end retail providers. And it was the things Emily has already described: easy in, easy out, very high quality space, but yet still affordable. And then on the right, you've got the sort of other end of the scale, which is Inch Arts, who were an existing community organisation, who were offered quite a large building, not in the sort of centre of Altrincham, but on the edge. And their whole thing is about health and wellbeing through arts and accessible space. So they had everything from classes for people wanting to learn about art, all the way up to sort of Fab Lab that professional artists could make use of. And they had that on a meanwhile basis on a peppercorn lease, and it continues to be a part of their sort of overall approach to creating a ecosystem in their spaces to make sure that they're incubating uses all the time, and they can then go on to fill vacancies as they arise. So the resultant benefit of all of that was that in 2020, 10 years later, Altrincham was voted by the Times the best place to live in the UK, which is quite a huge turnaround. And in 2021, they actually won the accolade again. So just to say, meanwhile use, isn't the answer to all the problems, but it was an important part of the overall strategy. And another example of benefits at the scale of place is Barking and Dagenham, which is a borough in the east of London. So this graphic I find quite a sort of sad one, really, but just to explain what it shows that Barking and Dagenham is up in the sort of top left-hand corner of the graph, and it has a very, very low number of social infrastructure facilities and very high predicted prevalence of loneliness in over 65s. I think that just sort of paints a scene of the overall context of Barking and Dagenham, which had a number of social issues. So they elected 12 BNP councillors in one election, and then 4 years later, all of them lost their seats. So there was clearly a protest vote going on, massive demographic shifts, losing a third of the white British population in a few years, and it very high up on the sort of deprivation indices. So I think in amongst all that context, an organisation called Participatory City Foundation decided it would be the ideal place to test a mass participation project which used meanwhile use as the tool to make it happen. And that project was called Everyone Every Day. And it basically happened on a borough-wide scale. So it's quite a huge meanwhile use project, and made use of empty shops, but also fringe warehouse spaces reimagined as fab labs, but also tackled the sort of urban greening initiatives, took over streets for play spaces, had communal beehives, had lots of thinking around collaborative businesses. So rather than each fashion designer setting up their own business, they created collaborative business brands and encouraged residents to kind of work under those brands and test through that. And the benefit of this project was that, you know, by year, I think it's a 5-year funded project, and all the space was free of charge to use, because there's clearly a very clear need there for that sort of offer. But I think it really drastically changed the image of Barking Dagenham for its own residents. And then going down to the scale of a single space, this is an example, you know, bearing in mind that those two previous examples are quite different to the Brighton context. I wanted to pick one that was from a sort of more affluent area that doesn't suffer with vacancy rates. And this is at the Florence Trust, and is a kind of interesting example of someone that's gone from permanent back to meanwhile. And they occupy a grade 1 listed church in Highbury and Islington. It's an art space. They run a studio program from there, as well as exhibitions. And were doing so for 30 years, and then were pretty much a victim of their own success, and the landlords wanted to take it back. So what I found was on a website called the Creative Land Trust. And for those of you that don't know what a Creative Land Trust is, it's a kind of version of this community land trust model, which seeks to secure land in perpetuity for creative uses. So it's a good website to check out. But they did a really good interview with Florence Trust, asking, well, why would you bother with meanwhile use? You've had your own space for 30 years. Why go back into a temporary space? And I think it's a nice interview to go and have a look at. But the quote essentially sums it up, which is that they still see it, you know, 15 months is 15 months, and there's a lot that can be achieved in that time if you choose to participate and co-produce things within your community. And for them, they see it as a socially engaged project, a chance to connect with a new community and a new area, and a way to find new longer term opportunities. So down to the scale of a group. So the example I've chosen for you here is actually a meanwhile space project, and it's Granby space, again in another sort of high value, low vacancy area of London in Waterloo. You can just about see the London Eye poking up over the sort of red facade of the building. So meanwhile space had a low value porter cabin in a very high value area, and for I think it was about a 2-year period, running it as a creative workspace. And the group of tenants that moved in there were unknown to one another before. And at the end of the meanwhile use period, actually went on to formed a sort of loose collective and went on together to sort of negotiate a longer term lease in a permanent creative workspace. So the benefit to them was definitely the chance to connect, collaborate, and consolidate and sustain what they were doing. And another similar example is the Old Bakers Creative Collective in Rock House, Hastings, another meanwhile space project, which I love a lot. And because they'd occupied space together before, I think we were able to see that they really they had a track record. And so when they were offered space in Rock House, they were able to negotiate the exact fit out they wanted as a collective, the right kind of communal spaces, the right kind of studio spaces. And it just gave them that sort of track record and communicated that seriousness of intent to us. So then down to the scale of the individual, this is Mark and Fold, who run it's a micro business making sustainable stationery products, sourcing their paper from Cumbria and Scotland and using recycled coffee cups. And so Amy Cooper, who ran it previously from a kind of private studio space. When Meanwhile Space opened the Blue House Yard project, which is a series of 2-story wooden make and sell huts on an old car park, so not on a high street, behind a council building tucked away, she thought, actually, this is exactly what I need. I want to use direct retail to accelerate my business. And she took one of the huts on. It's kind of not, a low cost space, quite a beautiful space ready to move into. And she ran her shop production house there for about a year, and ultimately decided at the end of that testing period that direct retail didn't really work for her. She didn't really succeed in that in the way that she thought she would, but obviously in a very sort of low risk, cost controlled way. And the flip side of that story is Tailoring by Blue Man, who has a space in Meanwhile Foundation and Meanwhile Space project, Queen's Parade. And it's the longest running Meanwhile Youth project, I think, for over, just under 10 years now. And he started in one shop unit, just doing a very straightforward tailoring business, nothing that was going to win awards, but a very honest, creative, skill-based business. And then decided to turn his hand to upholstery, ended up actually doing really well and taking on 2 employees and then expanding into a second shop. And it's a business it makes ends meet. It's just a very simple business that ends up creating significant benefit for the 3 employees it has. And I just wanted to end on a sort of diagram that shows it's from Project for Public Spaces, who are kind of really at the forefront of thinking about placemaking. And for me, it's all, Meanwhile Use is one of many tools that can affect and impact place. And it's a bit of a tricky diagram to read in the round, but for me, Meanwhile Use really impacts the 3 quadrants: sociability, uses and activities, comfort and image. And, if you kind of look on the outer rim, it's all those things Emily spoke about, like increased street life, evening use, participation, diversity, growing Indigenous local businesses, affecting rent levels, affecting building conditions. It's all about sort of seeing, almost starting with a place-based audit of what is the need, and designing the Meanwhile Use project to deliver impacts that are relevant to that place. That's it from me. Thanks for listening. Hope it was useful.
Shelley is going to talk now a little bit about her experiences of Meanwhile Use in a Brighton context.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Shelley. I'm just going to read from my screen so you get my trail of thought. I'm from the brilliant Brighton Bid. So we're a not-for-profit organisation formed of 517 retail, leisure, hospitality businesses in Brighton city centre. And we all come together to put on projects such as the Christmas lights, the on-street ambassadors, enhanced street cleansing, and dressing the city in the summer with banners, hanging baskets and bunting. Back in February 2020, which feels like a very, very long time ago now, we partnered with Brighton and Hove City Council to start work on utilising the city's vacant properties. The project originally aimed to make empty properties look visually attractive, brighten up Brighton with window dressing, as well as connecting prospective pop-up shop tenants who potentially wanted to run small businesses with landlords and managing agents to fill unused properties and create a healthy high street. As you can all imagine, due to the pandemic, the project stopped and started again in line with the lockdowns. Work restarted again properly last March in 2021 with a focus changing from sourcing low-cost pop-up shop opportunities to Brighton and Hove City Council, offering their properties to arts organisations. Before telling you a little bit more about how the project shifted, I just wanted to touch on my findings up until this point, as it might be useful for this conversation. And Emily also touched on this in her intro as well. So sourcing low-cost properties in Brighton city centre was trickier than initially expected. Managing agents who look after properties on behalf of landlords were telling us that they still have appetite from tenants. You know, if they've got people wanting a 5-year let, they were after those with a decent rental budget. And in fact, the number of vacancies in the city centre didn't drop between February 2020 and last autumn, and we were still 5% less than the country's national average as well. And these figures are from my own research. So I personally took to the city centre streets to undertake regular vacancy rate surveys, and not from elsewhere. So I know there are accurate representation. Managing agents also raised concerns about needing substantial deposits and legal fees from short-term tenants to ensure properties were looked after. However, for many small businesses or people just looking to start out, looking to take on these spaces for short periods of time, these amounts just proved too high for them. It was also difficult to contact landlords directly without going through the managing agents, of course, wanted to earn commission for their work. The landlords that I did manage to contact directly weren't all locally based. So the element of philanthropy for doing something good for Brighton just wasn't there. I feel that more philanthropy is needed to make projects like this work. However, we do understand that there should be more incentives for landlords to get involved. And as Emily outlined, there is some fantastic incentives for landlords. We just need to play on the philanthropy part of things a little bit more. And also as well, obviously, if they're getting interest from businesses wanting to sign up for 5 years and pay the expected rent, this does make finding low-cost pop-up opportunities and even window dressing within the city centre a little bit more difficult than we expected. So with these findings in mind, the project then shifted from sourcing these vacant premises for short-term rental opportunities to Brighton and Hove City Council supporting the project further by offering their very few empty retail and hospitality premises to arts organisations to utilise on a 6-month contract. This was rent-free, and organisations were just asked to pay for utilities. We had over 20 applications for the project, showing such creativity and enthusiasm for it, with one of the applicants being Jane and William, who opened the Bookmakers in a vacant Brighton Hove City Centre property in Cranbourne Street back in July last year and closed in January this year. I'm sure Jane and William will share their insights, but it was really wonderful to work with them on creating a community bookshop where writers could meet and mentor underrepresented writers too. It quickly became a creative community hub with events and workshops to further inspire creativity. And I'm so pleased with all they achieved. I'm sure they're going to discuss their highs and lows in a little while, but yeah, it was really good working them on the project. Unfortunately, due to other shortlisted applicants not being able to financially afford the reintroduction of business rates, which were paused during the pandemic and then reintroduced again from July 2021, albeit at a 66% discount and then a larger discount if you're a charity, which the bookmakers were able to take advantage of. And then also legal proceedings with getting keys from a previous tenant taking a little bit longer than expected. It meant that only one property was let. The bookmakers were our flagship pop-up for the project. We also focused on commissioning up to 5 local artists to create window displays to help create opportunities for them to share their work, and also with our mission to brighten up the city centre as well. So this was quite a big one, because over 80 artists submitted proposals for the theme Brightening Up Brighton. I think you might be seeing a couple of these, and it was amazing to see a varied range of artists and their mediums interpreting this brief. We were really lucky to secure rolling gallery space in the former Snow and Rock unit in Hannington's Lane, with thanks to their very supportive landlords on this. This meant that we could, for 4 months over the summer, showcase 3 artists' work. So these included Nikki Shale, also known as Originary Arts, bold, eye-catching Bauhaus-inspired designs featuring paper figures, which really celebrated all things Brighton. The Lightness of Being, a project by award-winning duo photographer Hugh Fox and performance artist Darvish McCarr. Hugh and Darvish have been collaborating with body of work for years, including photos, film and live performance. And the work shown in their commissioned window was a reaction to the fast-paced world we live in, and a gentle reminder that we can slow down and connect with ourselves and our environment. They use familiar locations in Brighton, tweaking conventions and teasing out possibilities inspired by their surroundings and states of mind, allowing for a spontaneous space of creativity and play to open up, which is just really wonderful to see, especially in the hubbub of the city centre. And then lastly, 23-year-old Zenny Zhang, an MA sequential design and illustration graduate from the University of Brighton. For her installation, researched the top 10 most used apps in the world during the COVID-19 pandemic. All these apps that connected people and offered escapism during challenging times. She extracted the main colours and usage features of each app and created illustrations inspired by them as part of her display. And this was her first commission, so it was a great opportunity to be able to support her with this. Well, there were more challenges than I expected to the project. The pandemic, tenants being liable for rates, and landlords not wanting to reduce city centre rents due to their own demand, as I've spoken about previously and Emily also touched on. It's been really interesting to work on. It's been so refreshing to see the enthusiasm that projects like these encourage, and also see the creative communities want to get involved. And we've also seen exciting new independent businesses open up in the city centre during this time as well. I feel going forward, with space still being at premium in the city centre, and for arts organisations, this space is potentially not being large enough. I've had quite a lot of requests for studio and performance spaces, and obviously a lot of places in, say, North Lane are just not going to be big enough for those. And still being in high demand, it's time for those looking for spaces to get a little more creative with how this might come to be, potentially looking at areas with lower footfalls and rents outside the city centre, and maybe utilising unused office blocks, and more ideas. I'm sure Meanwhile Space had plenty of ideas, and they outlined some when she was speaking as well. I think my final thoughts are there needs to be some more philanthropy and understanding from all those involved in meanwhile uses, whether that's managing agents, landlords, prospective short-term tenants, and also creatives, to be able to offer opportunities and work together a little bit like a jigsaw, which I hope conversations like these open up. So yeah, that's me.
So my name's William Shaw, and I'm a writer, and I spent pre-COVID, I spent time visiting bookshops, quite a lot of time in bookshops, because that's part of what I do. And I noticed two things. One, that bookshops are one of the only types of shops that's actually prospering in numbers. And the second thing is that it was pretty clear why they were prospering. It's because they don't just do selling stuff. The ones that have succeeded have become social businesses, and they work with local communities and schools and writers groups and readers groups and festivals, and they've become part of the community. That's kind of why they're expanding. And as lockdown struck, and it was obvious that lockdown was going to be an additional pressure on retail, I began wondering whether you could do something in terms of a pop-up with that model that bookshops were using. And the initial idea was about inviting writers to become part of a shop in return for what they could do with for the community and the community of writers. And this project, as was hinted before, is really about key partnerships. And the very first and the most crucial key partnership right at the beginning was between myself and Creative Future, because they're a charity who work with emerging writers and particularly underrepresented writers. And of course, we started looking around immediately and found exactly what Emily and Shelley have been talking about. Retail space in Brighton is very rare, and that was always going to be a challenge. And the second partnership we brought along was an existing bookshop, because neither me or Jane from Creative Future know anything about bookselling. And Goldsborough Books is a Brighton-based bookshop. And it's important, I think, for our point of view, to have friends, to work with the existing retailers' friends, not as competitors, because we didn't want to put a bookshop that was another thing that was competing in already fragile space. So if the ask was, if they stock books for us, could they help us pay for this project? And they said yes.
They did. And then, as Shelley has also mentioned, around March 2021, very conveniently, Brighton Improvement District, Brilliant Brighton, put out a brief to arts organisations who might be interested in a pop-up space in central Brighton for a 6-month period. So we submitted an application, we were shortlisted and we were interviewed, and then invited to check out we looked at 2 spaces that were available in the city centre, and we were very, very lucky to be offered the retail unit in Cranbourne Street. And I think we have some pictures of, there we are, there's the unit. That's the sort of day we went and had a look round, having a rummage inside and discovering that actually the space lent itself really well to a bookshop, so we're really delighted about that. But we did then at that point start to think about what else we needed to have in place in order to make sure this project was a success, and I started to work on a detailed budget in terms of costs we need to look at. And I thought it might be useful just to go through this for those of you who are kind of interested in a meanwhile space. So rates, we were being gifted this space rent free, but we did have to pay for rates. Creative Future is a charity. We were eligible for the charity discounted rate, which is significant. And also, as Shelley said, there was some government discount around the pandemic, which we had for a little bit, but not for the entire run. And I think, as Shelley also mentioned, some organisations who weren't charities, who had been shortlisted at that point, were like, yikes, this isn't going to work for us. So that's worth thinking about. There were utilities, water and electricity. In our case, we had to cover the cost of that. Also insurance for our book stock, for our people, our volunteers, but also members of the public coming into the space in terms of public liability insurance. And we also had to pay for some building insurance. Making the space ready for opening, we had to decorate the space, we had to clean it. It had been empty for 18 months before we took it over, and it was really not very clean at all, particularly the basement area. We had to think about display, we had to think about practical things like rubbish clearance, and how that was going to work and how we paid for that, and maintenance around the heating system, the alarm system, and also making the space fully accessible, because it didn't have, there was a step up into the shop, there wasn't a wheelchair ramp, so all those things had to be considered. And then our staff costs. We knew that the space was only going to work if we could run it by volunteers. And so both William and I and David Headley, who's the CEO of Goldsborough Books, put a lot of voluntary hours in to make this happen. The one sort of paid role that we did pay for was our volunteer coordinator, because volunteers don't organise themselves, and she did an absolutely fantastic job in reaching out and pulling together our amazing team of volunteers. We also paid our workshop leaders, but this was through some funding that Creative Future had in order to pay for those workshops. And so, yes, partners. William's going to talk about partners.
Yeah, so I mean, I've already mentioned Goldsborough and obviously Creative Future as being key things, and obviously brilliant Brighton, them bringing us the opportunity, but they also brought us continual feed of sort of expert knowledge, you know, the connecting us to knowledge to the council and the various things we needed to know, and then we're able to help us publicize it. It's something that Jessica, I think, talked about. You know, you can't do all the heavy, you don't know everything, can't do all the heavy lifting. Partnerships are really, really, really important for this. And we needed our partnership with our established writers who came in on board and loved it, because everybody loves the bookshops. The mentors and volunteers came in. Our lovely logo, again, you need to make an impact. So that was a local company, Wolfstrom Design, who got it installed in our window. It costs of thousands, but done as volunteer stuff. Then the writing agencies were really crucial. Writers Mosaic came aboard to help run some of the workshops we were doing, and the key writing agency down here at New Writing South. Not only did they do one strand of the workshops, we needed chairs. They had chairs. We needed that wheelchair ramp. They had the wheelchair ramp. It really is about making the ask, really quickly and available to other people.
Yeah, and of course also our established writers that William got on board, about 15 of them, who all volunteered, some of them coming into the shop to help run the shop, but also we ran a mentoring program, and a number, I think about 8 of our writers built mentoring relationships with sort of 8 of our underrepresented writers. Some of them were initially just 3 hours, but some of them that are still ongoing, so that was a really important thing. And our amazing, brilliant, I can't say enough about how wonderful our volunteers were. They turned up, they rolled up their sleeves, they got in there and cleaned up the space and got it ready for opening. And the bookmakers launched on the 14th of July 2021. And there's some of our wonderful volunteers and some of our wonderful writers on the day we opened, and it was a very wonderful day. Shelley was there. Are you in there somewhere? I think it was a really good day. Here's some of our writers in the space. Yeah, it was fantastic to get there. But I thought it'd be useful to talk about our challenges a little bit, because there were quite a lot. One of the, and we didn't mention Brighton Hove City Council. Obviously, they were a key partner in this, because this was, as Shelley mentioned, a Brighton Hove City Council owned space, and through all the work that Shelley had done, they had sort of gifted us this space for 6 months. We didn't know, in terms of unknown costs, we didn't know what the rates charge was going to be, and we didn't know what our utilities charge was going to be. And in fact, you know, we're still negotiating on what we're paying for rates, even though the building, you know, the pop-up has finished. And similarly with utilities, we weren't able to find out, just in terms of previous tenants, what on average they were paying for electricity and water on a monthly basis. And that made it quite difficult in terms of, you know, heading into a project when there are costs that you didn't know or just didn't even have a ballpark figure for, but also having to make sure that we were keeping enough in the pot to cover those costs when we knew what they were. The building was very challenging. The actual shop and the shop space itself was great. The basement and the undercroft really wasn't. It was really disgusting, if I'm honest. It was very damp. It was very neglected. It was, you know, we couldn't store our books down there because it was too damp. We had a flood. We had a plague of drain flies. We also had problems with the main door into the space. And I have to, at this point, say huge thanks to Barney Simpson-Hayes from Everson Young, who is the managing organisation for the building. But he basically volunteered for us and came in and helped us do some work on the building and got very dirty into the act as well. Our heating broke down, the alarm system played up. We had a rough sleeper who had sort of made the doorstep of our shop his home during the 18 months that it had been closed. And so we had to spend, and we didn't sort of kick him out. He was there throughout our pop-up, in front of our shop sometimes. But we had to really sort of spend quite a lot of time negotiating an arrangement with him in terms of like, no, you can't sit on the doorstep when the door's open because you're stopping customers coming in, this sort of thing. So I just thought it might be useful to sort of highlight some of the things that we had to kind of deal with once we were, you know, in the run up to opening and the actual opening. But here we are. These are some of our wonderful volunteers. We did a thank you to our volunteers just before we closed, and that's some of our lovely volunteers there, you know, having an opportunity to meet each other. Some of them hadn't all met because they're all doing different times and shifts, but there they are. And also I think there's some of our workshop program images. Are there?
30 volunteers took part. You're going to go through the wins.
Oh, the wins. Yes, we had about 30 volunteers who signed up. It was really lovely because I think there's a lot of people in Brighton and Hove who have an ambition to kind of, on their bucket list, work in a bookshop. So we did have a fantastic response, and we had some amazing volunteers. We had nearly 5,000 people visit the shop over our period of opening, and that was in terms of obviously our people who came in to buy, but also for our events and also for our workshop program. We ran 20 workshops in the space, so we transformed the space in the evening into a workshop space, ran 20 workshops there. We nature journaling for health and well-being, writing yourself to better mental health, hidden their stories, and we also ran 12 book events. William was going to talk about them.
Yeah, I mean, we over the course of the period we sold about, just to actually supply the costs, you know, having these prices in there, we sold about £13,000 worth of books, which produced the income, which hopefully will have covered those costs that we're still not quite sure what they are. And we ran book events featuring writers and industry professionals like Jared McGuinness, Sarah Jafari, Dorothy Coomson, Joelle Taylor, who won the T.S. Eliot Award shortly after appearing at our shop, and we like to think that was linked, Vaseem Khan, Nadine Matheson, Rose Thomas Schusker from Virago Books gave a fantastic workshop, and we were able to run the Creative Future Writers Award in the space, which was obviously a great thing to have done. I should have flicked through those. Anyway, where that was us. This is what we feel we achieved in the space, and it was very useful. We probably overrun our 10 minutes significantly now.
No, I think we're okay. Just hang on, 1:35. Look at that. Wow. Timing. Yeah, it was amazing project, but you know, huge amount of commitment required to realize it.
Thank you. Yes, what a fantastic project, and also really useful to get some of that insight into the practicalities of what it takes to put something like that together.